Chapter 17, The Progressive Era, Section 3, Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. When muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair began research for a novel in 1904, his focus was the human condition in the stockyards of Chicago. Sinclair intended his novel to reveal the breaking of human hearts by a system that exploits the labor of men and women for profits. What most shocked readers in Sinclair's book, The Jungle, published in 1906, however, was the sickening conditions of the meatpacking industry. This is a direct quote from The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. There would be meat that had tumbled out onto the floor in the dirt and the sawdust, where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption tuberculosis germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and thousands of rats would race about on it. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. End quote. President Theodore Roosevelt, like many other readers, was nauseated by Sinclair's account. The president invited the author to visit him at the White House, where Roosevelt promised that the specific evils you point out shall, if their existence be proved, and if I have the power, be eradicated. Theodore Roosevelt was not supposed to be president. In 1900, the young governor from New York was urged to run as McKinley's vice president by the state's political bosses, who found Roosevelt impossible to control. The plot to nominate Roosevelt worked, taking him out of the state office. However, as vice president, Roosevelt stood a heartbeat away from becoming president. Indeed, President McKinley had served barely 6 months of his second term before he was assassinated, making Roosevelt the most powerful person in the government. Theodore Roosevelt was born into a wealthy New York family in 1858, an asthma sufferer during his childhood. Young Teddy drove himself to accomplish demanding physical feats. As a teenager, he mastered marksmanship and horseback riding. At Harvard College, Roosevelt boxed and wrestled. At an early age, the ambitious Roosevelt became a leader in New York politics. After serving 3 terms in the New York State Assembly, he became New York City's police commissioner and then assistant secretary to the U.S. Navy. The aspiring politician grabbed national attention, advocating war against Spain in 1898. His volunteer cavalry brigade, the Rough Riders, won public acclaim for its role in the battle at San Juan Hill in Cuba. Roosevelt returned a hero and was soon elected governor of New York, and then later won the vice presidency. When Roosevelt was thrust into the presidency in 1901, he became the youngest president ever at 42 years old. Unlike previous presidents, Roosevelt soon dominated the news with his many exploits. While in office, Roosevelt enjoyed boxing, although one of his opponents blinded him in the left eye. On another day, he galloped 100 miles on horseback, merely to prove the feat possible. In politics, as in sports, Roosevelt acted boldly, using his personality and popularity to advance his programs. His leadership and publicity campaigns helped create the modern presidency, making him a model by which all future presidents would be measured. Citing federal responsibility for the national welfare, Roosevelt thought the government should assume control whenever states proved incapable of dealing with problems. He explained, quote, "It is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people and to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid him to do it." Roosevelt saw the presidency as a bully pulpit from which he could influence the news media and shape legislation. If big business victimized workers, then President Roosevelt would see to it that the common people received what he called a square deal. This term was used to describe the various progressive reforms sponsored by the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt's study of history, he published the first of his 44 books at the age of 24, convinced him that modern America required a powerful federal government. Quote, "A simple and poor society can exist as a democracy on the basis of sheer individualism," end quote, Roosevelt declared. Quote, "But a rich and complex industrial society cannot so exist," end quote. The young president soon met several challenges to his assertions of federal power. By 1900, trusts, legal bodies created to hold stock in many companies, controlled about 4/5 of the industries in the United States. Some trusts, like Standard Oil, had earned poor reputations with the public by the use of unfair business practices. Many trusts lowered their prices to drive competitors out of the market and then took advantage of the lack of competition to jack prices up even higher. Although Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, the Act's vague language made enforcement difficult. As a result, nearly all the suits filed against the trusts under the Sherman Act were ineffective. President Roosevelt did not believe that all trusts were harmful, but he sought to curb the actions of those that hurt the public interest. The president concentrated his efforts on filing suits under the Sherman Antitrust Act. In 1902, Roosevelt made newspaper headlines as a trust buster when he ordered the Justice Department to sue the Northern Securities Company, which had established a monopoly over Northwestern railroads. In 1904, the Supreme Court dissolved the company. Although the Roosevelt administration filed 44 antitrust suits, winning a number of them and breaking up some of the trusts, it was unable to slow the merger movement in business. When 140,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike and demanded a 20% raise, a 9-hour workday, and the right to organize a union, the mine operators refused to bargain. 5 months into the strike, coal reserves ran low. Roosevelt, seeing the need to intervene, called both sides to the White House to talk and eventually settled the strike. Irked by the, quote, extraordinary stupidity and bad temper, end quote, of the mine operators, he later confessed that only the dignity of the presidency had kept him from taking one owner, quote, by the seat of his breeches, end quote, and tossing him out the window. Faced with Roosevelt's threat to take over the mines, the opposing sides finally agreed to submit their differences to an arbitration commission, a third party that would work with both sides to mediate the dispute. In 1903, the commission issued its compromise settlement. The miners won a 10% pay hike and a shorter 9-hour workday. With this, however, they had to give up their demand for a closed shop in which all workers must belong to the union and their right to strike during the next 3 years. President Roosevelt's actions had demonstrated a new principle. From then on, when a strike threatened the public welfare, the federal government was expected to intervene. In addition, Roosevelt's actions reflected the progressive belief that disputes could be settled in an orderly way with the help of experts, such as those on the Arbitration Commission. Roosevelt's real goal was federal regulation. In 1887, Congress had passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which prohibited wealthy railroad owners from colluding to fix high prices by dividing the business in a given area. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, was set up to enforce the new law, but had little power. With Roosevelt's urging, Congress passed the Elkins Act in 1903, which made it illegal for railroad officials to give and shippers to receive rebates for using a particular railroad. The act also specified that railroads could not change set rates without notifying the public. The Hepburn Act of 1906 strictly limited the distribution of free railroad passes, a common form of bribery. It also gave the ICC power to set maximum railroad rates. Although Roosevelt had to compromise with conservative senators who opposed the act, its passage boosted the government's power to regulate the railroads. President Roosevelt's enthusiasm and his considerable skill at compromise led to laws and policies that benefited both public health and the environment. He wrote, quote, "We recognize and are bound to war against the evils of today. The remedies are partly economic and partly spiritual, partly to be obtained by laws and in greater part to be obtained by individual and associated efforts." End quote. After reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, Roosevelt responded to the public's clamor for action. He appointed a commission of experts to investigate the meatpacking industry. The commission issued a scathing report backing up Sinclair's account of the disgusting conditions in the industry. True to his word, in 1906, Roosevelt pushed for the passage of the Meat Inspection Act, which dictated strict cleanliness requirements for meat packers and created the program of federal meat inspection that was in use until it was replaced by more sophisticated techniques in the 1990s. The compromise that won the Act's passage, however, left the government paying for the inspection and did not require companies to label their canned goods with date of processing information. The compromise also granted meatpackers the right to appeal negative decisions in court. Before any federal regulations were established for advertising food and drugs, manufacturers had claimed that their products accomplished everything from curing cancer to growing hair. In addition, popular children's medicines often contained opium, cocaine, or alcohol. In a series of lectures across the country, Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist at the Department of Agriculture, criticized manufacturers for adding harmful preservatives to food and brought needed attention to this issue. In 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which halted the sale of contaminated foods and medicines and called for truth in labeling. Although this act did not ban harmful products outright, its requirement of truthful labels reflected the progressive belief that given accurate information, people would act wisely. Before Roosevelt's presidency, the federal government had paid very little attention to the nation's natural resources. Despite the establishment of the U.S. Forest Bureau in 1887 and the subsequent withdrawal from public sale of 45 million acres of timberlands for a national forest reserve, the government stood by while private interests gobbled up the shrinking wilderness. In the late 19th century, Americans had short-sightedly exploited their natural environment. Pioneer farmers leveled the forests and plowed up the prairies. Ranchers allowed their cattle to overgraze the Great Plains. Coal companies cluttered the land with refuse from mines. Lumber companies ignored the effect of their logging operations on flood control and neglected to plant trees to replace those they had cut down. Cities dumped untreated sewage and industrial waste into rivers, poisoning the streams and creating health hazards. Roosevelt condemned the view that America's resources were endless and made conservation a primary concern. John Muir, a naturalist and writer with whom Roosevelt camped in California's Yosemite National Park in 1903, persuaded the president to set aside 148 million acres of forest reserves. Roosevelt also set aside 1.5 million acres of water power sites and another 80 million acres of land that experts from the U.S. Geological Survey would explore for mineral and water resources. Roosevelt also established more than 50 wildlife sanctuaries and several national parks. True to the progressive belief in using experts, in 1905 the president named Gifford Pinchot as head of the U.S. Forest Service. A professional conservationist, Pinchot had administrative skill as well as the latest scientific and technical information. He advised Roosevelt to conserve forest and grazing lands by keeping large tracts of federal lands exempt from private sale. Conservationists like Roosevelt and Pinchot, however, did not share the views of Muir, who advocated complete preservation of the wilderness. Instead, conservation to them meant that some wilderness areas would be preserved, while others would be developed for the common good. Indeed, Roosevelt's federal water projects transformed some dry wilderness areas to make agriculture possible. Under the National Reclamation Act of 1902, known as the Newlands Act, money from the sale of public lands in the West funded large-scale irrigation projects such as the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona and the Shoshone Dam in Wyoming. The Newlands Act established the precedent that the federal government would manage the precious water resources of the West. Roosevelt's concern for the land and its inhabitants was not matched in the area of civil rights. Though Roosevelt's father had supported the North, his mother, Martha, may well have been the model for the Southern belle, Scarlett O'Hara, in the Margaret Mitchell's famous novel Gone with the Wind. In almost 2 terms as president, Roosevelt, like most other progressives, failed to support civil rights for African Americans. He did, however, support a few individual African Americans. Despite opposition from whites, Roosevelt appointed an African American as head of the Charleston, South Carolina Custom House. In another instance, when some whites in Mississippi refused to accept the black postmistress he had appointed, he chose to close the station rather than give in. In 1906, however, Roosevelt angered many African Americans when he dismissed without question an entire regiment of African American soldiers accused of conspiracy in protecting others charged with murder in Brownsville, Texas. As a symbolic gesture, Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. Washington, head of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, an all-black training school, was then the African American leader most respected by powerful whites. Washington faced opposition, however, from other African Americans, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, for his accommodation of segregationists and for blaming black poverty on blacks and urging them to accept discrimination. Persistent in his criticism of Washington's ideas, Du Bois renewed his demands for immediate social and economic equality for African Americans in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois wrote of his opposition to Washington's position. This is a direct quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. So far as Mr. Washington preaches thrift, patience, and industrial training for the masses, we must hold up his hands and strive with him. But so far as Mr. Washington apologizes for injustices, North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brighter minds, so far as he, the South, or the nation does this, we must unceasingly and firmly oppose them. End quote. Du Bois and other advocates of equality for African Americans were deeply upset by the apparent progressive indifference to racial injustice. In 1905, they held a civil rights conference in Niagara Falls, and in 1909, a number of African Americans joined with prominent white reformers in New York to found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP, which had over 6,000 members by 1914, aimed for nothing less than full equality among the races. That goal, however, found little support in the progressive movement, which focused on the needs of middle-class whites. The two presidents who followed Roosevelt also did little to advance the goal of racial equality.